Hello everyone, my name is Chris Sankaran. I'm an assistant professor of statistics at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I wish I could join in person for this session. Unfortunately, things didn't work out. I've added my contact information here, so if there's anything at all you'd like to discuss, please do reach out. So today what I'm going to be sharing are some thoughts about interactivity and interpretability, and these are all discussed in a lot more detail in 2 review articles that I've added at the very end. Okay, just to set the stage, I want to highlight a couple interesting trends. So first is rise of foundation models. Right, so you've probably heard of this. These are models like ChatGPT, which are trained on very diverse, very large-scale data, and they're being used to solve many different kinds of tasks at once. Right? You train it once, and you can apply it to many different applications. And if you step back, that's a very big change from how people traditionally used to train machine learning pipelines. Traditionally, it would be a very specific task, a very specific loss function, and you would optimize your training just to solve that one task. Okay, so this is a big change in how we're thinking. Second is the rise of multimodal datasets. Right? So this example, what I'm showing here, this comes from a dataset that's pairing images with free text. Right? What's really interesting here is, traditional image algorithms, you might be able to classify parts of the image into specific, like maybe 1,000 classes, right? But now you're able to query these images using free text, right? So there are 2 kind of very different modalities that are now kind of very closely connected. And finally, we're seeing lots of interesting ways in how we interact with these models, right? These aren't models that are living in some sort of distant place, generating predictions that you only access after the fact. These are models that are generating outputs, generating predictions on the fly, and allowing you to interact with them. So these are all very exciting developments. There have been some interesting instances, though, where things go quite wrong. Right? So this is one of my favorite examples of what can happen when you don't really understand what's going on in these kinds of models. So this was from the demo where Google released Bard, which is the ChatGPT alternative. Right. And in this demo, they were trying to highlight how cool this chatbot is by asking, what new discoveries from James Space Webb Telescope can I tell my 9-year-old about? Right. And these are all kind of neat facts. And the only issue is that this last one is not true. And people didn't realize that, there were pictures of exoplanets taken before James Webb 20 years ago, right? Until a bunch of astronomers on social media started highlighting, like, hey, we knew about this. This is not a correct demo. Right? So this raises a bunch of issues about these models are kind of black boxes. Is there anything that we can do to try to understand how they're exactly working so that we can avoid these sort of embarrassing outputs and maybe more worrisome in more kind of impactful legal or medical settings, right? This sort of output could actually cause a lot of harm. Okay, that begs the question, what exactly makes a model interpretable? Right. This is a difficult question. There's been a lot of activity in the community, and there's really no consensus yet about how we should be discussing interpretability. But I think there's a really interesting analogy between model interpretability and visual effectiveness. Right, so I want to develop this analogy, and I think it also reflects some of the more nuanced thinking in the community now. So what exactly makes visualization effective, right? Here are just a few kind of baseline characteristics, right? You should be able to read the figure, right? If there's really tiny elements or you can't actually read it, then that makes it illegible. But you should be able to understand what each part means. It should be annotated. Right? And it should be information dense. Like there shouldn't be any extraneous ink or kind of busy material that's not actually communicating meaningful information. And so here's an example. This is Edward Tufte did an analysis about kind of visualization in relationship with the Challenger disaster. So the argument is that if people had used better visualization practice, maybe the Challenger disaster could have been prevented. This is supposed to tell you the relationship between the amount of damage on the space shuttle launch and temperature, right? But it's almost impossible to read. And he just replots it, where there's temperature on the x-axis, damage on the y-axis. You can see that there's kind of a clear negative relationship. and this was the predicted temperature, or this was the actual temperature forecasted for Challenger. Right? So it's kind of obvious that there would have been very high O-ring damage, but no one had made this plot. Right? So those are 3 important characteristics for visual effectiveness, and there are many more. Right? If you think a little bit more carefully, right? So one, provenance. Right? If you don't really know where your data came from, then it doesn't really matter how fancy your visualization is. Right? Second, there's audience. Right? If you're making a visualization for a specific kind of domain, and everyone in that scientific domain is already very familiar with certain terms or certain symbols, then that might be a very good visualization for that audience, but it might not be useful at all for a more general audience. And there are many more of these kinds of nuances. And my point here is that sometimes in the model interpretability space, people talk about interpretable versus black box models as if it's like a very hard kind of dichotomy, but really there's some nuance, right? In the same way that a visualization that's effective for one audience might not be effective for another, a model that's kind of useful and interpretable for one context may not be useful or interpretable in another. Okay. And I want to just introduce a little bit of vocabulary because I think this also helps to tease apart the different kinds of interpretability and the different properties that we should be looking for in these sort of AI models. So the first is a distinction between an inherently interpretable model and an explainability technique. Right? You can think of an interpretable model as one where you can see all its components directly without having to come up with any post hoc explanation. Right? So these are models like decision trees or sparse regression. You know exactly how all the inputs affect the outputs in some more transparent way. In contrast, an explainability technique is something that's applied to a black box to try to gather more information about it after the fact. And I think of it as like a flashlight. It's the thing that illuminates kind of what might be going on without really telling you exactly the internals. Some more vocabulary. There's a difference between a local and a global explanation. So a global explanation is supposed to give you a summary about the entire model. So you think about some very complicated decision surface. The global explanation might be some kind of summary about the entire decision surface, while a local explanation tells you about how to interpret an individual prediction. It's like a sample-specific interpretation. And so instead of telling you something about the entire decision boundary, you might be able to understand locally at a particular point on that boundary what is the plane. Okay, I want to give a couple examples about how interpretability works. So the running simulated data set is this data set that I've made up that's trying to understand how kind of a longitudinal microbiome profiling might work. Right? So the hypothetical study is you've gathered data for people over 2 months. For each of these samples, you have a profile of many different bacteria species. And people know things like the presence of certain bacteria or certain trends in these bacteria can be related to health outcomes. So I'm imagining a situation where you have either disease or healthy people at the end of the study, and you're kind of curious about whether there are any trends in any specific bacteria that might be related to those 2 outcomes. And the thing that makes it tricky is that these trends, these kind of trajectories are very complicated. Right? I've simulated everything, and I know the ground truth of how I generate these, but it's not obvious just looking at the output what are the features that are associated with different outcomes. Okay. Now, it maybe is not totally obvious, but you can apply GPT to this kind of data as well. So if you think back to classical, how transformers work, they're doing some sort of representation where they take the words, they first one-hot encode them. So here it would be like, we love to learn from. And then given some sort of representation of these one-hot vectors, it can make a prediction of the next word. Right? So that's ordinary text, how prediction works. But you can think of this microbiome example that I just showed as being kind of analogous, where instead of having words, I have bacteria species, and I have the amounts of them over time. So it's not just words over the sequence, it's species over time. And at the end, you're trying to compress all of these abundance profiles into a prediction of whether they're healthy or diseased. So you can apply the exact same architecture to this problem. The problem is now you can predict well, and so here I'm just showing you can get an accuracy that's nearly as good as accuracy of something that knows how I generated the data, right? But how do you actually do science from that model, right? It's more interesting to be able to attribute those predictions to specific properties of these species or their trends. So let's try to understand explanations, right? One general way that you can start understanding these sort of, these are called embeddings, these representations that the model has learned. One way that you can try to understand these embeddings is do some sort of dimensionality reduction. So here's a really interesting example that's looking at kind of a traditional text kind of transformer model and analyzing the embeddings learned by that text transformer model, where what they did is they took this word fair and they looked at all the instances, different sentences where people are using the word fair, and then they embedded that word in these different contexts. And what you find when you do the PCA of those embeddings are you see very clear separate clusters where the different clusters correspond to different interpretations or different meanings of the word fair, depending on how people are using it, right? So it could be fair use, it could be fair coin, it could be world fair, and you're seeing the separation even though they're all the same word. Okay, so here is showing that same kind of embedding idea for that microbiome example that I just explained. And the thing that really pops out is if you just do the original PCA on the original data, there's a little bit of a difference between the disease and healthy groups, but it's quite hard to see. While if you do the analogous representation on the embedding space, there's much clearer separation. And this makes sense because the transformer has been trained to try to optimize the difference between these classes. You also notice there's a big difference in the variance explained. Okay, once you have these embeddings, some things that you can do to try to understand them, you can try doing these sort of interpolation exercises. Right? So take two samples that seem quite different from one another, draw the line between them in this high-dimensional space, and then look at samples that are close to that line. Right? And then that can show you how one kind of sample can morph into another kind of sample. And it's interesting because in this case, it's bridging these two different classes, and it's helping highlight what are some of the features that might be related to the class response. It's not necessarily the features that stand out the most to us visually. Right? So in this example, you can see differences in the height at the starting time. That seems to be actually quite related to the response along this trajectory. Right? And that's maybe not the most obvious characteristic in advance. Okay, so embeddings are a kind of global explanation. They take original model and then try to understand how it works. An alternative way to think is to actually go in and modify the architecture of the model. Right? And one idea I think is very interesting is something called a concept bottleneck. So in a concept bottleneck is instead of going directly from whatever the input is to the final prediction, so here's the bird image to the bird species, you first try to predict some sort of dense annotation. So in this case, the dense annotation, experts have gone in and they've labeled the wing color, undertail color, beak length, all these properties about the birds. And then you first just train your complicated model to predict that dense annotation. And from that dense annotation, you learn a very simple model for that final step. So one way you can think about this is, in traditional standard data science, you might go in and define hand-engineered features, right? You might kind of go hand-engineer and say, in this part of the image, how much of it is yellow, right? So maybe it would figure out that there's a yellow head here. But instead of doing that kind of hand-engineered features, you just define what kinds of features you want, and you give some example training labels of what those features would be like, and then you train the black box, the complicated model, to predict those features. Okay, so and another final point is that for these kind of models, you only need those sort of dense annotation during training time. When you get to test time, it's like the model will automatically derive those features and then use those in the final simple prediction. Okay, so this is kind of graphically how I think about the difference. So this is like our earlier transformer model. It just takes the input, transforms it into some sort of embeddings, and from those embeddings, it directly makes a prediction. Versus in the concept bottleneck, we take what this last part had been, these embeddings, and we use those embeddings to instead predict the concept annotation. From this concept annotation, you can use a more interpretable, like a linear model, and then try to understand how those more interpretable concepts relate to the response. Another advantage of this is that you can go in and intervene on specific concepts. You can say, I don't want a particular concept to be relevant for the prediction. And you can achieve that by now just zeroing out certain links between the concept and the final output. And that's possible because you've chosen a very simple model at that final step. Okay. And in the case study that I showed before, the performance actually goes a little bit increasing. And it's also nice because you can interpret each instance's why it got the prediction that it got. Okay. I want to leave a few minutes to talk about interactivity in addition to just interpretability. My motivation for thinking a lot about interactivity is that in a lot of scientific applications of generative models or simulation, it's really important to have some more control, right? And some interesting examples of this. Here's a simulator that's used for long-term climate projection, right? You get predictions across the entire globe, some very rich simulator. Here's a simulator that's very common in the single-cell genomics space. So people will simulate kind of synthetic single-cell data. I think of these kind of simulations as being kind of the new lingua franca of science. Across many different disciplines, people are getting used to thinking about generating synthetic data to encode their theories, to benchmark different methods. It's somehow a little bit more accessible than the abstractions that had been more common in the past. Okay. So how can you make those sort of generative models a little bit more interactive? One idea is you should be able to build it up from simpler components. Right. So here I'm showing these are different kinds of basic building blocks for larger generative models, represented as their diagram. And the point is, these aren't just, they could be used as models on their own. Like this would be logistic regression, this would be latent drill allocation, this would be like a hidden Markov model, right? But you can also think about it as, just parts that you can link together. So if you want to have a time-varying latent drill allocation model, you could combine these two panels into a kind of new kind of larger graphical structure, right? And that encourages interactivity because you're not thinking about the model as some black box that you can't deconstruct. Instead, you're thinking of the model as built of many more simpler components. Okay. Another sense which models can be interactive is you should be able to take an existing simulator and then be able to modify it. So this is a toy example, but what I'm showing is here's real data, and then here are a sequence of simulators that are trained to try to match that real data. And then since the components are all modifiable, right? Here I'm just modifying the covariance, I'm modifying the likelihood. Since you can modify it one step at a time, you can gradually iterate and improve your model. And here, the colors that I'm showing are one way of gauging the quality of a simulator, right? You try predicting the difference between, like, is this a real sample or is it a synthetic sample? By this point, you have a lot of trouble making that prediction, and that indicates that this is a better representation. This is a better simulator than the simulator was. Okay. And then it doesn't just have to be interactivity in the design stage. You can also have interactivity in this use stage. So here's a really interesting simulator coming from the response to the COVID pandemic. It was called COVASIM. What you could do is you could modify a whole bunch of different kind of lockdown related parameters, and you could see what are the forecasted disease trajectories. Like what would be the burden? How many deaths would there be under different kind of policies? Right. So one of the kind of interesting aspects here is that it's not even a probabilistic model. It's a purely agent-based model. So they're just defining small agents, what rules govern their behavior, and then letting the system propagate. But there are ways to bring it back to statistics. So kind of in this review article, we discussed different kinds of statistical emulators. So the idea is you train these, or you simulate many examples of these agent-based models. Then you learn kind of a statistical approximation so that given the mapping, so like starting from the parameters, you can just approximate what the simulator would have given without actually having to run the full simulator, because these sort of agent-based models can be very time-consuming to train. Okay. So I mentioned I had some review articles that discuss all these in a lot more detail. Here are the links. You follow these QR, you'll be able to access those papers. I'll just pause a second in case you need to get this. Yes, and finally, I just wanted to acknowledge my lab, my funding, and again, here's my contact. I hope you all enjoy the conference. If you ever would like to discuss any of these ideas related to interpretability or interactivity, I'm always very happy to have any discussion. Thank you very much.